What you're looking at has been known throughout most of its history as simply Korea. Where I am is known as South Korea. Since 1953, the North and South have been in a state of perpetual war. Even standing here just a few miles from the demilitarized zone, I can hear the periodic ring of gunshots as the South Korean military runs drills to prepare for potential combat. In the mainstream media, this conflict is often discussed in very black and white terms: the repressive communist hermit country in the north and the open and free U.S. ally in the south. But to speak of Korea in such simplistic terms does a great disservice to its tragic history and the resilience of its people. I'm Anya Parampil, and I'm in Korea to take a look at what's behind the saber rattling and look at the situation from the ground up.
This is alert now on North Korea, now saying nuclear war could break out at any moment.
Neither side can just charge in and go across that land to attack the other. So if the North wanted to step this up and make it happen, what do?
At Kim Jong-un's nuclear bomb testing site, a stir of new activity.
Running drills this week to remove non-military Americans out of the Korean peninsula.
During the campaign, you called North Korea the greatest threat to the U.S.
The threat in the region is North Korea's nuclear weapons program.
At the end of World War II, we designed a new world order. Look at the crisis we're facing in North Korea. This is really serious.
Watching the mainstream media, you'd probably believe people in Seoul live in constant fear of instant obliteration from a nuclear strike directed by the North. But in reality, such drastic military action seems unlikely. The South Korean capital is nestled just 30 miles from the 38th parallel, meaning any fallout from an attack here would surely find its way north of the division. It's not a division which came to the Korean people naturally. Rather, it formed directly out of years of colonization and war imposed from the outside. With tensions roiling on the 38th parallel at the center of today's global stage, I went to Seoul in search of the historical roots nurturing this conflict. The Korean Empire was proclaimed in 1897, but was short-lived. Within a few years, Japanese troops marched onto the peninsula, and in 1905, the Japan-Korea Treaty declared Korea a protectorate of Japan. In 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea into its empire, taking a major step in the direction of conquering China. Can you describe what Japanese rule was like?
Japanese colonialism is really unprecedented in comparison with other countries. Imperialism mostly just means taking over economic power. But Japan tried to eliminate Korean culture. They didn't allow Korean people to use the Korean language. They only taught the Japanese language. They really destroyed the Korean people's way of thinking.
All horrors unleashed in the lead up to World War II, when Koreans would serve as cannon fodder for the Japanese Imperial Army. Koreans were sent to the front lines of the war, and tens of thousands of young Korean women were forced into sexual slavery, known as comfort women to Japanese soldiers. It's a chapter of World War II often overlooked in the United States. In 1939, Korea's colonial governor, Jiro Minami, demanded Koreans literally erase their identities and adopt Japanese names. 80% of the population complied. The 1942 National Mobilization Law conscripted Korean workers into forced labor in mines throughout the Japanese Empire. 5.4 million Koreans were conscripted. Over 600,000 were sent throughout Japan, where an estimated 60,000 died under harsh working conditions. When the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, marking the horrific end to an empire, it's estimated 20,000 to 30,000 Koreans perished. And although the U.S. bombing campaign and dropping of the atomic bomb ended the empire as it was known, fervor for Japan's reign over Asia has yet to temper among the Japanese ruling elite. In 2015, tens of thousands of Japanese poured onto the streets to protest Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's plan to revise the pacifist constitution established following World War II and expand the Japanese military. The next year, aides to Abe visited the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo to deliver a ritual offering on the leader's behalf. The controversial shrine stands to commemorate those who served the country's imperial ambitions, including countless young men forced into conscription. Among those honored by the shrine are over 1,000 convicted war criminals, 14 of which are considered Class A.
Japanese imperialism conquered Korea, and they tried to eliminate all the sovereignty of the Korean people. They tried to enlarge Japanese territory, and that's why Korean people participated in protests to resist Japanese rule. Around 5 million Korean people participated in that independence battle against Japan, and a couple 100,000 Korean people died. 70 years have passed since Japanese colonization, and still Japan hasn't expressed any regret for what they did. So Korean people have an invisible conflict with Japan. Japan imperialism is quite different from European imperialism. Japan didn't eliminate the wrongdoings of imperialism up to now, and they still haven't issued an apology. Some Japanese governments have tried to make their military stronger, and we are worried about that. To keep peace in the world, this kind of imperialism is a worrying point. Regarding shrine worship, that might be a Japanese traditional custom, but to us, Japan is a war criminal, and having this worship there is unacceptable.
The end of Japanese rule gave Koreans hope they'd soon be a sovereign nation. What happened in Korea during World War II?
During World War II, the Korean people thought they'd have a chance to be independent, so our independent troops fought against Japan.
But the dream of a self-determined, unified Korea quickly transformed into a nightmare. Can you start by explaining why there's a North and South Korea to begin with?
The Korean division have two stages. One stage is the formation around 1946 and 1947. The global Cold War started. And by that global Cold War, I think the Korean division started from first stage.
The South Korean government wasn't declared until 1948. It's 3 years after the end of the war, end of World War II. So the U.S. occupied the southern part for 3 years before separate republics were declared.
The South's new leader, Syngman Rhee, had been flown back to Seoul aboard U.S. General MacArthur's personal plane in 1945. 3 years later, General MacArthur met Rhee in Seoul to celebrate the Republic of Korea's founding. Living in the U.S. since 1904, Rhee was a staunch anti-communist, and so the stage was set for the Cold War to turn very hot in Korea.
Separate republic was declared in 1948 in South Korea, and then it was only after that that North Korea was declared a northern republic. But leading up to that, in the north, the Soviet Union accepted the surrender of the Japanese there, and the people that were in sort of taking power locally were the people that had fought the Japanese. Guerrilla wars in northern Korea and in Manchuria. Not only Kim Il-sung, but other Koreans that had fought the Japanese, some who had fought the Japanese in the South. So that was what the leadership was in the North. And in the South, the U.S. pretty much saw these kind of local committees that sprang up that were nationalists and wanted to have, one Korea, immediately sort of imposed, kind of Cold War glasses and looking at them, and collaborated, put in power a government that was composed a lot of the Koreans who'd collaborated with the Japanese. And they were like running the government and also the police force. And then they started like training the South Korean military. But, sort of like the national security state was kind of controlled by these people that had collaborated with Japan. And they were for, they didn't want to have a merger with a northern communist republic. A lot of people left the North after the communist government was declared in North Korea. A lot of people left because they were landowners and had benefited from the colonial period, and they went down the South too. So they just kind of formed this sort of rear guard of like super anti-communists in the South, and a lot of those people were recruited into the South Korean police. At that time, it was like, this is the first step of global communism taking over the world, and this is just part of Stalin's plan to dominate the world, and there was a lot, you know, they completely imposed this, you know, Cold War, you know, myth basically on Korea. I mean, Stalin did give approval to Kim Il-sung, but it was a Korean war. It was the, you know, the North Korean armies wanted to kick out the South Korean government that was being supported by the U.S.
Ernie Trory reports in his book Churchill and the Bomb, quote, on the 7th of October, 1949, Syngman Rhee boasted that the South Korean army could take the North Korean capital of Pyongyang within 3 days. On the 1st of November, the New York Herald Tribune reported that Sing Sung-mo, the South Korean war minister, had declared that his army was ready and waiting to push into North Korea.
I mean, the North Korean armies did invade in June, you know, in full force, June 25th, 1950, and swept all the way down until this perimeter around the Pusan port where the U.S. held on and the South Korean forces of Syngman Rhee held on. And they did sweep all the way through. And, you know, the North Korean armies came through certain areas where there had been insurgencies in the last few years. They were joined by, you know, insurgents, you know, in, like, say, in the southwestern part of Korea, where I've spent, you know, a fair amount of time. There were people there that, you know, fought with the North Korean armies as guerrillas. But for the, you know, for the most part, you know, I think there was a lot of opposition.
When the communists came, I was at a loss as to what to do, as I had a feeling that if I did not fight against them, I would die.
This man joined the UN-backed South Korean forces and says he fought every day for 3 straight years. But it only took until October 1950 for the Republic of Korea and their UN allies to repel DPRK forces back north of the 38th parallel. They didn't stop there. The United Nations sought to reunify Korea under Rhee's U.S.-oriented leadership, having passed a resolution in 1947 recommending a national government be established to, quote, take over the functions of the government from the military commands and civilian authorities of North and South Korea.
And MacArthur, with Truman's, you know, permission, they actually, under the cover of the UN, invaded North Korea at that time. That was a pretty critical decision. And they tried to take all of Korea and place it under Syngman Rhee. And so that brought the Chinese in.
A sudden, unforeseen factor changes the entire course of the war. Chinese communist troops crossed the Manchurian border and helped the North Korean Reds drive back UN forces.
64 years ago, this train was bombed on a resupply mission to communist forces in the north battling UN troops. Today, it stands frozen in time, much like the 38th parallel.
The Korean War is a second moment to consolidate of the Korean division. So if we explain the Korean division, one stage is the global Cold War, and the second stage come from the Korean War. So the formation and consolidation is very, very useful word to understand the Korean division.
How has that divide impacted culture here in the South specifically?
By the Korean War, we have antagonistic emotion and the political ideological confrontation between the South and North. If the Korean War not, I think we are similar to the situation of the Germany after the 1945. But after the Korean War, the situation, Korean financial situation has been changed.
Are you taught a critical view of the Korean War?
It's been critical to North Korea, basically. It's a war that North Korea invaded South Korea, and then it's a kind of the war that this communist tried to dominate the Korean peninsula, initiated this war and things like that. I'm not saying that that is not true or that is not the part and character of this war, but I think we should have more holistic perspective to see why this war happened during the Cold War era and what was the international dynamics that creates this war, instead of just blaming North Korea as a main sole enemy of South Korean government.
Museums are usually exhibitions of history, but here at the Korean War Museum, one's reminded that a war which began over 5 decades ago never really ended. The war thrust the peninsula into a state of perpetual conflict and left Koreans on both sides wondering if they'd be utterly annihilated. During the war, Seoul was burned to the ground, and up to a third of the population in the north was killed. Meaning, even in Korea today, extermination is not an abstract concept. This is Pyongyang, the capital of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea today. The fact it stands so tall is somewhat of a miracle.
And after the Chinese pushed U.S. forces down south, the U.S. just bombed North Korea, until it was nothing but cinders.
Over the target, it's bombs away.
Throughout the war, the U.S. dropped 635,000 tons of explosives on North Korea, including over 32 tons of napalm. For comparison, that's more than the around 500,000 tons of bombs dropped on the entire Pacific theater during World War II. In fact, American generals modeled their bombing of the North off the devastating firebombing of Tokyo and Dresden. U.S. Air Force General Curtis "Bombs Away" LeMay remarked in a 1984 print interview, quote, "We went over there and fought the war and eventually burned down every town in North Korea anyway, some way or another, and some in South Korea too. Over a period of 3 years or so, we killed off, 20% of the population of Korea as direct casualties of war or from starvation and exposure."
That's left a terrible scar and memory in North Korea that they've never forgotten. And it's really why they, build weapon systems and nuclear weapons to defend themselves.
It's 1,000 pities that the same blooded people fight together and they kill each other, brothers, sisters, even parents. So the war should not happen again.
The Korean War not only cemented the division of Korea and the separation of millions of people from their families, it also established a permanent U.S. military presence on the peninsula.
The alliance was to stop North Korea, and of course it also kept, U.S. troops on the land in Asia.
Though the U.S. UN occupation of South Korea ended decades ago, the American military presence in the country is still very strong. This is the Yongsan base. It's the largest in the country and right in the middle of the South Korean capital. In 1953, 25,000 American soldiers were deployed to South Korea to fight the North. Today, 28,000 remain, and Korea is the heart of an archipelago of U.S. bases in the region.
Now it's shifted where it's, focused on North Korea, but troops in South Korea, U.S. forces and South Korean military are pretty integrated, and they're now closely integrated with Japan, too.
What is the impact of the U.S. military presence here on the Korean people?
Some people feel like that, yes, U.S. military presence here is actually protecting us from the threats in North Korea. So they feel like, okay, we feel safe if U.S. military is here. Some people, especially those people who are living around the bases, they are directly influenced by the U.S. Army's presence. As you see, everywhere around the military bases, there are similar problems. The crimes by the soldiers, the pollutions the contamination from the military bases, sexual violences, and then all those kind of things. So those people living around those military bases are experiencing exactly the same thing the people around the world living next to military bases experience. So, so some peace groups are calling for the immediate the withdrawal of the U.S. bases in here. PSPD position is that we don't call for immediate withdrawal, but eventually it should go towards the withdrawal of the U.S. bases. Why? Not because we hate U.S. military, but because not having U.S. military bases here, meaning that actually peace is settled in the Korean Peninsula.
Over the last several years, we've built a new installation here at Camp Humphreys.
U.S. Army garrison Camp Humphreys cost Korean taxpayers $11 billion. It was moved from Seoul to Pyeongtaek in 2006.
So those people living in Pyeongtaek has to be evacuated. But they're all farmers, and of course they are very close to their land because that's where they are living for. But then government violently cracked down those villagers and also evacuate them. The soldiers actually evacuate all the villagers in that area. That struggle is one of the harshest struggle that we've ever had in our civil society movement.
More recently, protests erupted over the U.S. deployment of the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD, while President Moon Jae-in was elected in 2017 on a platform of rejecting the missile defense system. He caved almost immediately once in office. However, Koreans did win an important victory, as for the first time, they were not required to buy the system from defense giant Lockheed Martin, which will instead collect its $1 billion jackpot from American taxpayers.
We see there are three major problems of THAAD deployment in Korea. First of all, THAAD is going to be part of the U.S. MD system, the missile defense system. So by deploying THAAD in South Korea, that means they will be part of the U.S. pivot to Asia strategy, which will eventually threaten tensions in Northeast Asia. Secondly, they say that they deploy THAAD in South Korea to prevent North Korean missile threats, but when you see the distance between North and South Korea, it's quite close to each other, and THAAD is to prevent high-altitude missile the shooting. So when they shoot missiles from North Korea to South Korea, it will be low altitude because we are very close. That is why we say the THAAD itself is not going to be effective to defend the South Korea from North Korean threat. Lastly, the process of deployment of THAAD in South Korea is not democratic at all. It was not transparent. The government did not get any consultation or agreement from the villagers living in Seongju, as well as there was no proper discussion in the parliament. And the deployment process has been very untransparent. That is why we oppose the THAAD deployment in South Korea.
It sounds like THAAD might be more about Russia and China than North Korea.
We say that this is a part of the U.S. pivot to Asia strategy. So the official reason of deployment is to protect South Korea from the threats from North Korea. But then we believe that this is not going to work in that way.
Hwang Jin-hwa, the former chairman of the National Defense Committee in the National Assembly, talked to me about the importance of the military relationship between the United States and the Republic of Korea.
We are not simply talking about the allied country as we fought as a shoulder-to-shoulder kind of a comrade in arms, but we are sharing same value. As kind of a democratic country, freedom, and also human rights. We are respecting, and we are thinking the most crucial importance is keeping same value. We are sharing that. And so that's why we are continuously emphasizing the United States is the most important, our ally.
Is the allyship truly based purely on shared values? This year, South Korea quadrupled its reward for North Korean defectors offering secret or sensitive information about the government of Kim Jong-un or the state. Seoul now offers $860,000 for such information. The official state reward, cash payments for interviews, and massive pressure placed on these individuals often lead to fabrication, with tales sometimes proving inconsistent or unraveling altogether. Still, the mainstream media is filled with testimonies from North Korean defectors sharing harrowing tales of forced labor and starvation, all while the dark history of the U.S. ally in the South is overlooked. People think of South Korea today as an open, free, and democratic country and think that's why the U.S. is allied with it. But has that always been the case in the long history of our relationship?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, even under Syngman Rhee, it was a fascist police state then, and people were, anybody on the left was hunted down and put in prison and executed. And Park Chung-hee, who took over a military coup in 1961 and ruled, he was a general, and he ruled until 1979 when he was assassinated for 18 years. That was one of the world's worst surveillance and torture states. I mean, it's terrible in terms of human rights and political rights. It was just an abomination. And the U.S. always knew this, and Park was just a close military ally. He had a very powerful military.
Park even sent South Korean troops to fight alongside American soldiers in Vietnam. He was assassinated in 1979 and replaced with General Chun Doo-hwan.
Nancy and I, Mr. President, are pleased to welcome you and Madam Chun to the White House. And you are one of our first guests here. We haven't lived here very long. And in looking about, I can't help but contrast the peaceful and rather elegant setting with a meeting that took place in your country 30 years ago in a building in your capital in Seoul that was badly damaged by the war. It was just after the landing at Incheon, and General Douglas MacArthur turned the command of the city over to President Ri and the civilian authorities of the Republic of Korea. And General MacArthur spoke then of the special friendship that exists between our two countries and of our mutual commitment to democratic principles and individual liberty and personal dignity.
Lim Young-taek had a personal encounter with what Presidents Chun and Reagan must have considered individual liberty. The year Reagan welcomed Chun to the White House, Mr. Lim's family relocated to the southern industrial hub of Busan. Like many curious 12-year-olds might do, as his parents moved in luggage, he wandered off to explore his new neighborhood.
I got lost, so I asked the police, and they said, stay here for a while. But then they took me to Brothers' Home.
Brothers' Home was an internment camp run by the South Korean government in the 70s and 80s. According to AP, the drunks, the unlucky, but mostly children and the disabled were plucked off the street and disappeared into these camps. At least 4,000 were kept at Brothers' Home. By 1986, up to 16,000 were kept in 36 similar facilities across the country. You were just a child. That sounds like a nightmare.
When I was captured, I was stuck in a truck, in darkness. I thought I died.
Once you were inside, what did you experience and witness?
Torture happened all the time. Sometimes they beat us, group by group. Some people died there. I witnessed some people's death. Also, I was a victim of sexual abuse. Torture every day, and sexual abuse. They beat us group by group with shovels. There are many different styles of beating. When I joined the Army, I learned some of these techniques. Similar things were happening every day in Brothers' Home. You know, around 10 or 11 in the nighttime, some of the senior members there would drop by. I was young, and they raped me.
What kind of feelings did you go through while you were inside, and did you think you would come out alive?
We couldn't have a social life, but we had the will to survive. So torture, labor, and beating doesn't make any sense to us. We just had a will to survive. We just endured everything, even torture. All of us were patient, suffering from nightmares, and we still cannot turn off the light in the nighttime, even though 40 years have passed.
In 1987, Brothers' Home was shut down after escapees alerted the press of its existence.
When I was in the camp, I didn't know what happened to my parents. But when I came out in 1987, I came to meet my father's friend. He told me my father died. My mother had moved on with a new life.
And so Mr. Lim moved on with his, eventually moving to Seoul to start over. He's one of the lucky ones who survived. The Korean government officially recognizes 513 deaths at Brothers' Home, though the real number is likely much higher. To this day, no one has been held accountable for the kidnappings, the torture, the forced labor, or the deaths.
Not vagrants. We were just ordinary common people. I just got lost, that's all. We want the government to express a sincere apology and give us recognition. We want an investigation to find the truth. Today, when I see police, my heart goes pitter-patter. I cannot stand it. I am a strong opponent of the police, and without drinking, I cannot go to sleep.
Mr. Lim is just one victim of the South Korean military dictatorship. As president, Chun began an effort to re-educate the population. The New York Times reported in 1981, army camps for, quote, hooligans were first opened in the summer last year after military leaders headed by General Chun Do-hwan took power. Between August 1980 and January 1981, a total of 57,561 people were warned or re-educated, according to the Korea Herald, an English-language newspaper in Seoul. The paper said that 38,259 of these underwent, quote, correctional programs in military camps.
You have a saying in your country that after the rain, the earth hardens. Well, the miracle of modern Korea is well known in the world.
And while 2017's modern Korea has made democratic strides, remnants of the colonial period and military dictatorship still stain the legal system. Can you talk about the national security laws which exist here?
National security law is a draconian law that basically cracked down human rights defenders and silenced human rights defenders in the country. The main reason, when you see the origin of this national security law, not even in Korea, but also in Malaysia and some other Asian countries, it's a kind of residue of colonization. So there was a law during the Japanese colonization related to the national security to crack down those Korean people who want to support for the independence of the Korea. And now when we have the new government set up, then the government changed the name into the national security law. And that law has been used to, as I mentioned, silence human rights defenders, because it's very easy to crack down human rights defenders when they say that, oh, you're harm to national security. Especially Article 7 is the one talking about the benefiting enemy, and enemy in this sense is North Korea. So if I make some comment, looks like supporting North Korea or even against the current government, it can be easily turned into like, okay, you're benefiting the enemy, so you're violating the Article 7 of the National Security Act. That is why for a very long time, civil society has been calling for the repeal of the National Security Act, as well as the UN and the international society has been called for the amendment and repeal of the National Security Law.
The New York Times reports in 2010, 151 people were interrogated on suspicion of violating the national security law, up from 39 in 2007. The number of people prosecuted for pro-North Korean online activities increased to 82 in 2010, from 5 in 2008. The number of domestic websites shut down for pro-North Korean content rose to 178, from 18 in 2009. During the first 10 months of 2011, the police deleted 67,300 web posts they believed threatened national security by, quote, praising North Korea and denouncing the U.S. and the government, a sharp rise from 14,430 posts in 2009. The laws are a reminder of the fact Korea is currently in a state of war, reflected as well in the joint military drills conducted by South Korea and the United States, which simulate the destruction of Pyongyang on a yearly basis. In 2015, North Korean leaders offered to pause their nuclear tests if Seoul and Washington canceled such drills.
They saw Libya, and Iraq collapsed. They think they collapsed because they don't have any nuclear weapons. If they have nuclear weapons, United States were hesitant to invade them, especially Iraq, because they have nuclear weapons, and they think U.S. will hesitate to, invade them. That's their thinking.
What about the joint military drills between the U.S. and South Korea? If you're Kim in the North, that seems like a simulation of your destruction. Do you think that helps the situation?
Of course. I think that helps South Korean people to feel more safe,
Russia and China have also called for a Freeze for Freeze initiative, which would include the resumption of the six-party talks, including Russia, China, Japan, the United States, and both Koreas. But Seoul and Washington have opted for a strategy aimed at weakening the government in Pyongyang through sanctions, based in the belief it will one day collapse on itself.
What would be the best outcome, in your view, in the coming years with respect to the government in the North?
They are not going to give up their nuclear weapons. So the best way, and also the most realistic way to realize peace between North and South is, to change North Korean government in better way. I mean, it could be, color revolution that happened in Middle East and Eastern European countries.
With help from the United States?
Maybe or maybe not.
What is Open Radio in North Korea, and how are you involved?
Before I become a congressman, I'm a North Korean human rights activist. I try to, put more information inside North Korea through various means. One method is through radio broadcasting. I'm the president of one of the North Korean radio broadcasting programs, so-called Open Radio for North Korea, and we also have some other group to do the same thing, and another group is doing, leaflet flying jobs through balloons. There is also a group who infiltrate secretly the USBs that contains South Korean news, dramas, movies, and songs. So I think that is very important way to change North Korean society.
Does the U.S. help you in any way?
I think so. Yeah.
Those projects?
Yeah. The U.S. some fund help us some grant to do that.
In fact, Open Radio Korea went off air in 2014 simply because U.S. funding for the project ran out. Perhaps that's why Washington doesn't feel the need to deal with Pyongyang as an equal. As Lee Dong-bok, a former member of the National Assembly who served on the Foreign Affairs Committee, explained to me, regime change has been the ultimate goal of Washington over the course of many administrations. Did the Korean CIA play any role in helping the United States achieve this goal?
We are entering into the realm of some covert and undercover developments, and we do not know what is developing in that darkness. And I don't know if Korean CIA, which is the National Security Intelligence Agency, has ever set its feet in that water.
Can you talk about the way American and South Korean intelligence agencies cooperate to promote what is characterized as democracy promotion and human rights in the North?
I'm personally very much aware of what had transpired in Poland during the Reagan administration era. And the Reagan mobilized a Reagan crusade in collaboration with the Pope. And he made a lot of investment in bringing some freedom into Poland, which resulted in the overthrow of the communist regime, which let loose the fall of the dominoes of communism in Europe. And I think in the case of North Korea too, we have a lot more to do.
So you'd like to see the United States usher in a sort of color revolution in the North?
Sure.
It sounds like what you're describing is a situation in which the United States would encourage some sort of color revolution in order to reunify under the South, under a more capitalist and pro-Western system.
Well, that is still hoped for by the bulk of the South Korean population. But we are now living against the backdrop of 7 years history, during which time we have never seen that kind of an aggressiveness on the part of Washington.
They will be met with fire, fury, and frankly power, the likes of which this world has never seen before.
President Trump is not backing up with backing up that remark with actions.
Is there a military option?
You know, military option cannot be ruled out as an alternative under whatever circumstances. But I don't think Washington is committing sufficiently to this particular kind of options in any credible manner.
What would happen to Seoul if this military option was carried out?
There are many possibilities. One possibility is that with the allied forces in Korea, combined forces, having gained sufficient intelligence and information about the North Korea's key military, spots, the U.S. in combination with the South Korean military can initiate a surgical preventive attack enough to remove all the nuclear-related installations and material that exists in North Korea. In which case, that may be accompanied by a second set of attack against all the command and communication networks. So that at the end of this initial round of military operations, what North Korea is left with will be the poor capability of operating military operations only at the level or below the level of battalions. Not enough to mount any meaningful military operations. That is the most optimistic way of seeing that picture. Some time ago, I got the impression that the U.S. military was making calculations and assessments and things like that along the line.
Under Bush?
Under Bush. Well, not only under Bush, but even under Obama.
It sounds like a lot of people would die under this option.
Well, it'll depend. It'll depend.
I mean, at least in the North, from what you describe.
Well, there should be some casualties, yes. But I doubt if the casualties are going to be that large.
But at the battalion level, the North still maintains a very strong artillery capacity.
Well, those artilleries are going to be demolished, if not at the initial 2 hours, but at least in a day or two.
Where does China fit into this scenario?
I think it'll depend a lot on how Washington, acts. If Washington acts with the kind of decisiveness, then I don't think China can move in. But in such cases, Washington should have some political gimmicks to China in terms of China's role in the aftermath of the extinction of North Korea.
Make sure that Kim Jong-un knows that if he acts in an aggressive fashion, the price will be extinction.
As South Korean officials speak openly to me about the prospects for the North's extinction, echoing the call of Washington's war hawks, Pyongyang's desire for nuclear deterrence seems less shocking.
North Koreans would rather eat grass than give up on their nuclear program, unless they feel safe.
No matter what, the President Putin from Russia or any other leaders of the country, leaders of the international community, whoever criticizing pressing North Korea is not right thing to do. They can say so, but South Korea and the United States and Japan and the other peace-loving countries should be together to be cohesive and with a strong belief that we can stop North Korean nuclear ambition. Utmost goal should be clear. If they don't follow or they don't give up, even though we concentrate our every effort together with our international community, then they can be collapsed.
The Trump administration is currently reviewing options for deploying higher-level weapons to South Korea. In fact, while I was in Seoul, a delegation of opposition lawmakers from the Liberty Korea Party visited Washington to request the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons.
I don't agree with them. The nuclearization agreement we signed on also in 1991, it's violating that agreement. It's a denuclearization agreement between North and South Korea. Actually, North Korea already violated it. I don't think South Korea has to violate it, owing to North Korea.
National Assembly member Lee Chol-woo led that delegation to Washington. I spoke with a lawmaker yesterday in a center-right party who says he disagrees with your request to bring nuclear weapons to the peninsula, and that doing so would be a violation of the South-North Joint Declaration on the Denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Isn't it?
North Korea already promised denuclearization many times, but they break the promise, and their promise is just fake. So we cannot believe North Korea. We cannot be treated any more like this.
But how did the arms race in Korea actually start? Shortly after taking office in 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower mulled a plan put forward by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to end the stalemate in Korea by dropping an A-bomb on North Korea and China. Eisenhower rejected the plan, along with a recommendation from Secretary of State John Foster Dulles to use limited nuclear attacks on North Korean troops. That year, North and South Korea signed a formal end to the hostilities of the Korean War, which included a demand no new quality weapons be introduced to the peninsula. But just 5 years later, in 1958, the U.S. deployed nuclear weapons to the South at the behest of Secretary of State Dulles. Throughout the 70s and 80s, hundreds of U.S.-supplied nuclear weapons sat in the South. And so the North developed its own nuclear program with the help of the Soviet Union. As the North advanced, clamors for the denuclearization of Korea intensified. In 1991, North and South Korea signed the Joint Declaration on the Denuclearization of Korea, and the U.S. withdrew the last of its nuclear weapons from the South. 3 years later, North Korea successfully negotiated an agreement with the Clinton administration, promising to disarm in exchange for 2 U.S.-supplied light water reactors. A Republican-controlled Congress prevented the United States from carrying out its end of that agreement, which included the lifting of sanctions and funding for those light water reactors.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens.
In 2002, in the shadow of 9/11, President George W. Bush listed North Korea as a senior member of the Axis of Evil in his State of the Union address. It was then that the nation withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and restarted its nuclear program, leading us to the tensions in Korea today.
The sanction policy have a very, very important to make peace, but the cost is so high, and we don't know the final result of the sanction policy. We are anxious about the crisis of the world. So many Korean people would not agree that the crisis of war. So many Korean people hope the United States more positive attitude to make a peace.
So Obama's policy of regime change failed?
Yeah.
Does a policy of regime change make peace more difficult?
Regime change policy is very, very secret, belong to the secret. But regime change is good or not?
If the peninsula were to reunify, is it necessary that the North give up 100% of its communist system? Or?
I think so many people hope the German case should be applied to the Korean peninsula. But I think different, because for South Korean people, peace and the coexistence between two Koreas is more important rather than the political unification. We should not give stress for the North Korean ruling class, ruling group. If they can feel more and more anxiety, is not good for conversate to make a dialogue.
But the United States does the opposite. It sanctions more.
Yeah, sure, sanction. Sanction is not good. The final goal of sanction policy is bottom-up uprising or regime change by the military coup or another way. But is this possible? And the other one, is this good in the long process to make a peace in Korean Peninsula? I think the trust between South and North Korea and between United States and North Korea is very, very important. Trust is very, very important. How do we make trust? I think the sanction policy is not good answer to make trust.
How can South Korea be a truly independent country with the dynamic and presence of the U.S. military you describe?
I think it's very hard to say that a country is truly independent in this globalized society, because every country is being influenced by each other. But then when you see the heavy presence of U.S. Government in this country, I think it's quite hard to say that we are truly independent. Sometimes Korean people joke that Korea is actually 51st state of the United States. It's a joke, but I think that shows how Korean people feel about U.S. presence and dominance in this country. But I want to also talk to U.S. media and the U.S. people as well as the U.S. government. If tension arises in this peninsula and if war really breaks out, it will be us who will be influenced by the policy. You know, maybe U.S. Citizens or U.S. media or even U.S. government will say things on their own benefit, or they don't actually forget there are actually people living in this country. But if war breaks out with these heightened tensions and those like vicious wars between each other, and then sanctions and then all those kind of things, if war breaks out, it's all us who is going to be influenced by those kind of comments. So I hope that we don't want war in this country anymore. So I really do hope that when they think about the foreign policies on North Korea and also on the Korean Peninsula, I hope that they can remember there are people living in this country who is actually living under the threat of the war every day.
The threat of war could not be more apparent back at Imjingak, near the border which has separated Korea since the end of World War II. For a so-called demilitarized zone, the presence of the military is palpable as the U.S. and South Korea rehearse their war against the North just a few miles away. Still, it's mostly civilians who visit here, bust in on tours from around the country. A divided people gather at Imjingak to gaze across the sweeping hills at their distant neighbors, once their fellow countrymen. It's also here where one meets Koreans like this man who know not just the threat of war, but war as reality, having battled their brothers already once before. He was 18 years old when the war broke out and agreed to speak with me about his memories. I asked him when he first heard the news of the war and how it made him feel.
Too much? Too much?
Silence.
Too much? It's okay. It's okay. Yeah, it's okay.
He looked at me with tears in his eyes, in shock, unable to respond. His relatives would eventually explain to me he was the only member of his family at the time south of the 38th parallel. Whether or not his parents or siblings survived the fire and fury brought by the United States north of the border remains a mystery. This man's agony echoes in the tragic tune ringing constantly throughout the visitors center at Imjingak. A large memorial dedicated to the famous melody known as 30 Years Lost stands out on the grounds, explaining to passers-by the tune's history. It was a theme song for a documentary produced by South Korea's public broadcaster, dedicated to the search for dispersed families. According to the plaque, the show is played for 453 hours and 45 minutes over 138 days and contributed to the reunion of over 10,000 separated families. It reads, quote, "The song is also well known in North Korea, and this monument stands here, waiting for the reunification of North and South Korea." It's a constant reminder of the misery endured by all Korean people, brought about by war and an internationally imposed division.
우리 남매 이제라도 다시 만나서 못다한 척 나누는데 어머님 아버님 그 어디에 계십니까 공배있게 불러봅니다.
When this song was written, it was 1983, and only 30 years had been lost. Now it's 2017, and reunification seems like a distant fantasy. Supporters of regime change are emboldened from Washington to Seoul, and the North continues its weapons tests in an act of defiance. As the rhetoric escalates, this sad ballad blares endlessly from a rusting monument.
우리 남매 이제라도 다시 만나서.
Mark Twain said it's easier to fool people than to convince them they've been fooled. That could be why America is so divided now, because people have been fed fake news, paid for by corporate interests. They beat you down until you believe their fairy tales. Well, here's a story for you. It's called The Big Picture, and it's full of facts, not fiction. Question more.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook.
American people deserve to know
What
answers.
difference at this point does it make?
We must guard against the military-industrial complex.
The Cold War is over.
We shall never negotiate.
An American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima.
To know war is to know that there is still madness. Yet, we do what we must.
The only thing we have to fear is I am officially running.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted.